All right, so hello, my name is Vasilios Kosmakos. I'm with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida. Today is Monday, April 25th, 2022. Who do I have the pleasure of speaking with today?
This is Jim Stevenson.
All right, Mr. Stevenson. So if you can begin by telling me a little bit about who you are and what your position is.
Well, I grew up in Orlando, and after finishing high school, I had no plans after that and ended up as a land surveyor for several years with the U.S. Navy and private land surveyors in the city of Orlando. And after a while, decided surveying wasn't what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, and determined I wanted to be a park naturalist with the National Park Service, which required a college degree. So I moved over to Hillsborough River State Park, 16 miles from University of South Florida, and got a job as a park ranger. Moved my family over there, and we lived in the park for 4 years while I finished my work at USF. And upon finishing there, I was promoted to chief naturalist of the Florida State Park System and was transferred to Tallahassee. So that's how I ended up in the Park Service. At that time, park rangers had limited duties. They repaired buildings, mowed the grass, hauled the garbage, picked up litter, and such maintenance tasks as that. There was no resource management, no park interpretation. And so I set about doing those things in order to prepare myself for the National Park Service.
I'm sorry, sir. What year are we? What year or years are we speaking about?
Okay, I graduated from high school in '58 and started at USF in '64 and moved to Tallahassee in '69.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, I didn't mean to interrupt. So, you got to the Natural Park Service.
No, conditions in the Florida Park Service were just right to remain right where I was. And I very wisely took the advice of some of my friends and stayed with the Florida Park Service. And everything went well after that.
Fantastic. So, how did you end up working for DEP then?
Okay, state government reorganizes periodically and shuffles things around. When I started with the Park Service, it was called the Florida Board of Parks. And in '69, it was dissolved and added to the Department of Natural Resources. And in later years, about the time that Governor Bush came on board, the legislature reorganized again and created the Department of Environmental Protection. And the state park system was under DEP. So that's how that came about.
And then, if you can just describe your role specifically. So, what did you work on during your tenure at DEP? What major projects did you do? That type of thing.
Well, as I mentioned, there was no park interpretation, and that's what the chief naturalist was supposed to do. So I set about creating a park interpretation program for all of the state parks. And in time, we started dealing with the environmental threats to the parks, no matter if they were an upland park or a spring. And as a matter of fact, we only had one spring in the state park system when I hired on as a ranger. That was Manatee Spring, that was purchased in 1949. In the 60s, Wekiva Springs was purchased and made a state park. And at that time, we got a new director who was simply outstanding at purchasing new parks. That was Nay Landrum. And so we got on an acquisition effort and just added many, many parks. Well, actually 16 state parks are named for springs now. So that's quite an accomplishment.
Fantastic. And then, so if you can kind of just describe how you essentially started working, how did you get to the point of working at the Department of Environmental Protection, and then the story about the Springs Initiative of Jeb Bush? So kind of, give me that timeline.
Try that again. I lost you.
So describe, so help me understand how you started working at the Park Service, and how that eventually led to your Springs activism, which ended up with talking to Jeb Bush.
Okay, Ishtutney Springs was purchased in 1970, and as I mentioned, I hired on or was transferred to Tallahassee in '69. So it was a brand new park to work on, and we knew nothing about springs other than that's a place where you went swimming. And the only threats that we knew of was from trampling by the users. Their feet trampled the aquatic vegetation and caused erosion. So if we could solve that problem, then as far as we were concerned, the spring was in good shape. We gave no thought to water quality. That was the responsibility of the Department of Environmental Regulation, and it was something that just was not on our radar. But over time, it became more and more important, and now, as you know, nitrates are an issue, and as well as other chemicals, and spring flow is an issue, and there are lots and lots of things affecting our springs today.
So, describe your relationship with Jeb Bush. How did you end up working with him? How did you end up being involved in the Florida Springs Initiative?
Okay. Jeb Bush came on board, took over as governor in '69, I think it was. And right off the bat, he was dealing with an issue at Ishtutney where there was a cement plant to be built near the Ishtutney River. And the public just went wild. They just wouldn't put up with it. The Gainesville Sierra Club was one of the leaders in stopping the effort. And there were editorials in virtually every major newspaper in Florida, the Miami Herald, the Tampa Tribune, the Jacksonville Times-Union, and on and on. The whole state was in an uproar over a factory going in. They thought on the edge of the Ishtutney. Actually, it was 4 miles away. But Jeb Bush perhaps had never seen a Florida spring, nor had his new secretary of the Department of Environmental Protection, David Strews. So they needed to see the Ishtutney so that they could make some judgments as to whether or not to permit this cement plant. And so they needed somebody to guide them down the river, and I was selected to do that. So we had a canoe trip on the river. I explained what was happening to Florida's springs, and by the time we left Devil's Eye, which is one of 8 named springs on the Ishtutney, Secretary Strews said, well, we're going to form a task force to determine what the problems are and how to fix them, and I want you to lead the task force. Well, that was pretty good news for me. And so I set about selecting a task force of 16 people from the experts from each water management district and so on. And we created a report that came out in 2000. and had a whole series of recommendations, 12 strategies that were required to protect Florida Spring, and lots of acts that we needed to take. So when the report came out, the governor's office got a hold of it, and they went to the legislature a few months later and obtained $2.5 million for the protection of Florida Springs. Now, today, $2.5 million may not sound like much, but that was the first ever funding for the protection of Florida Springs. Now, there had been money to buy springs, but that was a separate pot of money. But to have money to actually solve the problems, that was new. So we set about organizing some projects, got them approved quickly, and we started making headway to protect our springs.
And what was it, within the context, what was going on at the time that led, people to give money, where the springs in particularly bad shape at the time? What was the impetus for that?
Well, once people saw Ishtutney, they were in love with it. You can't go to a spring, and especially Ishtutney, and not care very much about it. So with the newspaper articles and the awareness that we had achieved, it was a natural for the public to support funding. And Jeb Bush provided that funding through the legislative appropriations for his entire 8 years in office. And Governor Chris did the same. When Rick Scott came aboard, he cut all the springs funding. So we went from having a good bit of money to solve problems to no money to solve problems.
So you've kind of mentioned before, right, that humans tend to be reactive instead of proactive beings. We tend to, react to problems instead of trying to solve them initially. Do you think, from a legislative point of view, that's because a lot of these politicians don't have the exposure to these springs, to this nature, that they're kind of just dismissing it?
Exactly. They can't put themselves out there to protect something they've never seen. And I saw a news clip recently where a legislator was being interviewed about funding springs, and he says, I've never seen a spring, and he was from Miami. And so how can we expect legislators to provide funding for springs protection if they've never even seen one? So one of the best ways to solve that problem is to take them on a field trip to see the spring, whether it's a canoe trip or an overland trip. And for 6 years until the pandemic, I led monthly field trips to the Wakulla Springs, an overland field trip. We started in downtown Tallahassee, 2 blocks from the Capitol, and by noon we were standing on the observation tower at Wakulla Springs. I had Congresswoman Graham on the tour one time. Another time was State Senator Ausley, and we had 5 Leon County commissioners and 2 or 3 Wakulla County commissioners. And so that's how you get people interested in springs. They've got to be able to see them to appreciate them.
So describe how the political climate has changed from your time working in DEP and in the Park Service to now. I mean, what's gotten better, what's gotten worse?
Well, there's more problems today. I'm told that something like 1,000 people a year move to Florida, and people are part of the problem. They cause erosion at the spring, And when they flush the toilet up on the hill, that wastewater, the effluent from the septic tank, can find its way to the spring. And so more people equals more problems. But on the other hand, if these people never see a spring, they aren't going to support them. So it's a dilemma. But I tend to think that awareness is the issue. We've got a couple of outstanding organizations now, the Florida Springs Institute, headed up by Dr. Bob Knight, and the Florida Springs Council, which is headed up by Ryan Smart, and they're doing excellent work. One handles research and education, and the other handles legislation and regulations and the politics. We also have individual alliances for some of the larger springs, like Wakulla Springs Alliance and Ishtutney Alliance and the Save Our Swanee. So those small local groups can have quite an impact as well.
So as a park ranger, you definitely, dealt with this idea of, an area being loved to death, quote unquote. I mean, through your experience, how do we help mitigate that issue?
How do we help make that an issue?
Mitigate.
Okay, well, if we have too many feet, trampling is the cause of harm physically in a spring. And it can take a while to accomplish these things. It took 50 years to end tubing on the upper Ishtutney River because tubing was damaging the upper Ishtutney. It took 50 years to accomplish that. So I tell kids on my field trips, they need to remember the 3 P's. One is passion. You've got to care. So that P is passion. Another is persistence. It may take a while. And patience. You just don't give up. Those are the 3 P's they get from me on the field trip. So you've got to hang in there, and in time, if your idea is good, it'll come to pass.
And then, so you've also mentioned, that as springs have degraded, right, specifically with algae, you're kind of noticing some rather deleterious effects. So I know algae has personally affected you and your health. To kind of describe that a little bit.
Yes, I'm genetically, I'm very susceptible to harm from cyanobacteria from some forms of algae. I was a very active whitewater kayaker. You have to go to the mountains for whitewater, and even those mountain streams had algae in them. I was a cave diver, as was my wife, and we've had to give up all water activities. No swimming, no wading. I mean, algae just knocks me out. So I know personally how bad it is, and others are suffering similarly.
And but have you found that this is becoming a more recurring issue with people that visit the springs, or do you think this is more or less unique to certain individuals?
Well, I think it's worsening because there's more nitrates coming into the system, and I know there's some argument as to how bad the nitrates are or what effect they're having, but nevertheless, nitrates are something that we can try to fix by reducing them before they get into the spring system. And of course, spring flow. If we lose spring flow, we can cause even greater algae problems. So those are two problems that we can work on. We should be able to handle the spring flow issue, the consumptive use issue through the water management districts, but at this point, that's not working very well.
And why? And why is that?
Politics. The people that are placed on the board by the governor are not in favor, it seems, in giving adequate springs protection.
And give me your opinion on the water management districts. So they're an unelected board, appointed by the governor. Some people make the argument that with springs conservation, with water quality, there has to be that, that needs to exist. But at the same time, having an undemocratic kind of board that governs water quality is also a bit problematic. What's your opinion on the way water should be managed, given your career?
Why should we manage?
How should we manage water? Do you think the water management districts are more or less effective at what they do, or do you think that need to be restructured?
Well, to date, there's words and then there's actions, and there's no shortage of words, but we aren't getting very far with action. So that's in my mind, that's what we need. We've got to keep the money coming in to solve these septic tank problem and this wastewater problems, and keep buying lands in the uplands. Some folks think, and we used to think that as well, that to protect a spring, you just buy it and make it a state park. Well, Manatee Spring was bought in 1949, as I mentioned earlier. And when I first saw it with my family in the 1960s, it was a gorgeous spring. And today it's awful. It is just awful, choked up with algae. And that's from the nitrates coming all the way from Chiefland, 5 miles to the east. The city of Chiefland dumps their stormwater into a sinkhole, and dye trace studies have shown that stormwater, that dye, goes 5 miles and comes out at Manatee Springs. So, and along the way, it picks up effluent from septic tanks that people live in the area, and some agricultural activities with nitrates and animal waste. So there's a lot within that 5 miles that's impacting Manatee Spring. So in order to protect the spring, yes, we want to buy it, but all we're doing is protecting the hole in the ground where the water comes out. We aren't protecting the water. And that's where we've got to place emphasis, is up on the hill, further up gradient, to take action in those areas.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up a really fascinating point, how, every single body of water in the state is more or less connected. And if we don't protect all of them, I mean, the problem is just going to get worse. That's what it seems like you're saying.
That's right. It's going to get worse. We've got to get serious about it. And field trips for legislators and county commissioners are one way to do it. We aren't doing enough of those. The Florida Springs Institute, whose mission is education as well as research, is doing a good job of getting people out to see the springs. And I was, for 6 years, I was leading tours of the Wakulla system, but unfortunately we've had to stop those. But that's what it's going to take, primarily education. That's the most important thing of all if we're going to succeed.
So we talk a lot about correlated with springs degradation. You'd recently mentioned that you saw my interview with Dr. Cohen and his work about dissolved oxygen. Kind of describe your thoughts on that. Do you think dissolved oxygen might be a little bit of a factor too? Do you think it might be both?
Well, oxygen can enter the spring system at karst windows. These springs are in karst areas, and that's where you have limestone that has dissolved out holes and caverns and caves and so on. And this new water from rainfall has oxygen in it, so that can provide additional oxygen to the system. But really old spring water that's down deeper, that's been there for perhaps decades, does not have much oxygen in it. So how to fix the oxygen problem is beyond me. But the nitrates are an issue, and we still got things to work out on that, and figure out just how that they're affecting the system. And consumptive use, we just can't keep pumping as if the checkbook's never going to run out. It'll run out if we don't cut back on the consumptive use. One thing that just annoys the devil out of me is driving through a subdivision and seeing people's sprinklers watering the asphalt pavement in their driveways. What a waste of water. People should know better than that. But again, education is the need there.
So I was looking at some numbers from this Swanee for the state. I was looking at some numbers from the St. John's River Management District website, and 55% or something along those lines of water usage in this district is the result of domestic usage. 25% of that number is because of lawns and the sprinklers, the stuff you just mentioned. Do you think that there might be an over? Do you think that we're putting more emphasis on agriculture than we should, and not focusing enough on kind of the lawn kind of type of thing? Or do you think?
We gotta do both. Got to do both. I mean, I'm looking out at my lawn right now. I haven't fertilized it in 29 years, and it's just as green as it can be. We don't have to use fertilizer. Unfortunately, folks that promote fertilizer won't tell you. They'll tell you the things to do to reduce fertilizer, but not once will they tell you you don't have to fertilize. That's purely voluntary. So, through education, some folks will change their behavior and some folks won't, even after they know better. And those are the ones that we've got to regulate. So some folks will do it voluntarily, others have to be regulated.
Interesting. And then, I'm sorry, one second. So then, what has gotten better with the way we view or manage springs? I mean, is there hope compared to the way things were 20, 30 years ago? Give me your thoughts on that. Or are things just objectively just kind of gone downhill?
I'm not understanding your question.
How have we managed things better from when you were first working at DEP? Have we made springs better in certain ways, or have things objectively just gone downhill with the way springs have been managed?
They've continued to go downhill, and good things are being done. The water management districts have money now that they can use to take on certain projects, and there's things that can be done. It's not time to give up. But from what I'm seeing, the springs are worsening. I was asked to lead a Senate committee during a legislative session a few years ago. They wanted to see Silver Springs, and that the Senate committee was focusing on protecting springs. So I was the tour guide on a glass bottom boat at Silver Springs. And I had not been there in a couple years, and so I didn't know the current condition until we got on the boat and looked through the glass, and I was shocked at how awful it looked. The water was green, the lime rock was covered in algae, there were no large catfish like I saw when I was a 12-year-old boy that went there. And it was so bad that I didn't tell the senators how bad it was. because I figured they would figure I was some wide-eyed environmentalist that they wouldn't believe. So I had to kind of cover over a little bit of it to keep them from thinking I was nuts. But it was pretty awful.
Wow. And this is over the course of how many years? 30?
Yeah, right. Yeah, when I first saw the springs, I was a 12-year-old Boy Scout when I first saw that gorgeous water coming out of the lime rock at Rock Springs near Apopka. You just don't see it today.
Yeah, that's incredibly unfortunate. One thing that's rather frustrating is that, when you talk to the water management in people, I mean, and they do good work, but I do think that there's maybe an overemphasis on their successes and not enough understanding of the failures that exist. I mean, if things were getting that much better as what the government is saying it is, we wouldn't have the type of degradation that you just mentioned.
Yeah, well, we one thing I've done over the years is try to find spring champions. That is, folks that have done good things. Like I found a gas station over in Lake City that had no stormwater management. The oil and spilled gas ran off the asphalt and right into a creek that went to Ishtuckney Springs. So I figured this just won't do. So when I got back to Tallahassee, I asked our regulatory people why that gas station didn't have stormwater facilities to capture those pollutants. And they said it was grandfathered in, that station was there before the regulations. So I went to meet the president of that business and talked to him about it and asked him if he'd take a look at it and see if he could do something about retaining that stormwater on site. I just asked, I was polite, I was friendly. He did it.
Well,
and we gave him a Springs Champion Award. And that's, to me, that's how you do it. We had a farmer in Wakulla County, just south of Tallahassee, and his cows went to a sinkhole to drink their water every day, and they stood there in the water recycling. As they drank at one end, it was coming out the other end. Well, that sinkhole was connected to a cave leading to Wakulla Springs. Well, Jeb Bush had provided that first $2.5 million. It didn't take $2.5 million to fix it. But what we wanted to do was keep cows out of that sinkhole. So we got with the Soil and Water Conservation District for Wakulla County and asked them, we said, we will provide the funding if you will fix it. So they put in a power line, put in a pump, put in a well, put in a watering trough, and put in fencing to keep the cows out of the sink. And the cows were happy, the farmer was happy, and we were happy. And that brought forth another Springs Champion Award. And one other example that I think is pretty neat. We had a Boy Scout troop in Lake City, and Lake City is within the Ishtuckney spring shed. And the scout troop stenciled on every storm drain in the older part of the city, drains to Ishtuckney Springs, on every storm drain. Well, this fellow was walking down the sidewalk one day, and he happened to read at that stencil. And as he walked, he saw in the concrete gutter along the street a stain, an oil stain. And he went and followed it, and it went to a car mechanic's garage where this material was coming out, going down that storm drain and on its way to Ishtuckney Springs. So he contacted DEP's regulatory people there in Lake City. They went and met with the man. He had 400 gallons of used oil in 55-gallon drums around back of his facility, and they were leaking oil, that nasty oil, onto the ground and going into the Ishtutney system. That's what education will do, and that's what volunteers can do. And it made a difference. All that oil was then properly disposed of and the site cleaned up, and that's a win. And there are a lot more of those opportunities out there if we would just look.
Wow. That's a really powerful example because, I mean, something as simple as a stencil, right, led to such a big effect. I mean, who would have ever guessed?
That's right. Hmm.
Wow. So it appears that, throughout your career, you've done an excellent job at kind of meeting people in the middle and, kind of showing them, the light, for lack of a better term, right? You met with Jeb Bush, right? You kind of helped change his mind. You met with the individual with the gas station, you changed his mind. You met with the farmer, you changed his mind. Why is that such an important thing to do to kind of get people, for lack of a better word, on our side?
Well, for one thing, whenever I introduced myself to whoever I wanted to work with, I did not say I'm from DEP. I said I'm from Wakulla Springs or I'm from Ishtutney Springs. They could relate to that without putting up their guard. So that's one little trick one learns.
Interesting.
We had another situation. There's a sinkhole called Emerald Sink just south of Tallahassee that is definitely connected. We know from dye trace studies and cave diver expeditions that this sinkhole is connected to Wakulla Springs. Well, divers found a car in the bottom of the sinkhole, and the sinkhole was 80 feet deep, and there was a sheen of oil on the surface of the sinkhole. So it was a given that water was going to Wakulla Springs. So I figured, and that, by the way, the car was a stolen car, and that's how it had been disposed of. So I contacted the manager of the property that owned it, St. Joe Incorporated, and as you probably know, St. Joe was a huge operation, the largest landowner in Florida at one time.
Wow.
And so I contacted their land manager and I said, the next time you're in Tallahassee, I'd like to meet with you. And he did. He came over and I took him to Emerald Sink and he says, well, what's going on? And I explained about the water flowing to Wakulla Springs. He says, well, what do you want me to do? And I says, I want you to close that road and to stop people from driving in through the woods to the sinkhole. He says, okay. So he brought in a huge dump truck full of sand and dumped them in the center of this road to where it was impossible to pass on the road. Figured problem solved. Well, the yahoos drove around the sand through the woods. So he put up railroad track fence posts with a steel cable in between to stop them from going through. They drove around. So finally, they leased the land to a hunt club, and that stopped it. Those hunters weren't about to allow anybody on that property when they had paid good dollars to lease it for hunting. So, and we eventually bought it. So now it's managed by the state of Florida, by Wakulla Springs State Park, and problem solved. So sometimes it takes a few steps to get where you're going, but you have to keep your eye on the ball.
That's a really interesting story. Um, so, how did you develop, this title, Father of the Florida Springs Movement? Was that, who gave that to you? When did you kind of first hear about that?
Well, I was honored by that title that Dr. Bob Knight bestowed on me. I was very pleased that he didn't say the grandfather of Florida Springs. But the father of springs protection, you got to have that word on the end, protection.
Yeah.
But it came from many years of working on springs. I put together a Springs conference, statewide conference in 2000 and another in 2003, and a Springs rally at the Capitol in 2005. And every educational effort we could think of was put into effect, and it's affected a lot of people. I mean, we've done some good, and how much worse would it be if we had not done any of those things?
Absolutely. And I guess the final question I will ask you is that, to anybody that's listening, right, to any of our audience, to any aspiring kind of protectionist, what words do you have to say to anybody that's listening?
Well, remember the 3 P's. You got to have passion. You got to really care about solving this problem. And it's going to take a while, so you got to be patient. And you don't give up, so you got to be persistent.
Fantastic. Well, I think with that concludes the interview.